so welcome you to this program tonight on feminism and partisan politics. I'm Donald Wheeler. I'm one of the coordinators of the Community Peace and Justice Forum, which is housed here at this Emmanuel Welcoming Church. However, we have a base that includes faith leaders and community organizers from around this region who are our steering committee. It's our mission to bring together disparate groups for dialogue in a safe and positive environment. We think this room is a really nice room for this activity. We're delighted to be co-sponsoring tonight this program for the first time. We're able to co-sponsor together with the Network for Responsible Public Policy, a group which I have the utmost respect for. Has been working on policy issues since 10 years ago. They have a wonderful website with most of the talks are on the website. And the dynamo behind this, the leader of the team, and they do have a team, is Rhoda Sherman. Good to see you. Sherman, the president. And many of us have been really informed and inspired by the programs of this group over these years. Our community forum's been in existence now for about 3 years. Has a little different focus. We're not focused on public policy as much as informing the community and hoping to mobilize the community for the public good in our communities here, not just Ridgewood. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. That's what I thought. Rhoda has a wonderful story. I think she's so busy telling about other people and getting them introduced that often her story is not told. Well, I can't adequately tell it, but she did tell me that she was in the industry of healthcare, and the word wasn't getting out about policies and options, and there was a lot of false information going around. So Rhoda said, we have to do something about this. And I think that was one of the main germination points of your activity. But she didn't stop at healthcare. So she's, over those 10 years, covered a whole number of issues and so on. And it's been a much great enrichment to the community. This is the first program, I'm ashamed to say, that we've had with our community forum that focused on women. Women were always a very major concern in all of the programs, but this focusing right on it, and I'm glad we could do this with Rhoda and also with you. It's going to be a wonderful evening. Please feel comfortable. There'll be some refreshments later. There's restroom down the hall, there's one across the way. You can feel free to say things. Okay? We want to spend the first part of the questioning period responding to Stacy's comments and so on, but we want to hear from you as well. So I know you're probably very quiet people and reticent to speak, but we expect there's going to be a good discussion and in a good spirit. We know we live in a very polarized situation in our country, but we all need to be kind to one another, and I'm sure that's what we'll be doing tonight. This program will be videotaped. If we were in the sanctuary, if we had an overflow, we were going to go in there and it would have been live streamed, but it will be recorded, and it will be on the Ridgewood.org website, and also NFRPP.org website. And if you signed up, and I hope you'll sign up on one of the sign sheets, Rhoda has hers, and we have one for the community forum. You sign up on one of those, then we'll send you the link to tonight's program. So without any further comment, I'd like to introduce Rhoda Sherman.
Thanks so much, Don. That was quite a nice opening for me. Thank you. And he's also said some nice things about NFRPP. I want to welcome you on behalf of NFRPP. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. As Don has said, he was one of our first members of our first audience. And every so often he comes to our programs, and we just love seeing his smiling face there, enjoying the information that he's getting from our really distinguished experts. So what Don did say is that almost 10 years ago, we launched NFRPP, and we launched it to combat fake news and misleading information, which at that time we were becoming aware of because of the Affordable Care Act, which was getting dumped on. So after we did a few programs on the Affordable Care Act, one of our audience members said, well, what about the Dodd-Frank Act? Well, we didn't know anything about that. So we said, okay, we're going to get a speaker and start educating and informing with trusted sources, bringing good information to the public so that you could all be more knowledgeable voters, make better choices on how you handle legislation, on how you advocate, and we have continued to do that. So if you go to this table, you will see that we are doing a variety of programs and many challenging issues. And we hope you'll join us at FDU, which is really our home base, but we do programs, and we're pleased to do them with the Emmanuel Church, and we're grateful to the Peace and Justice Committee for having us. So if you go to our website, you'll find out a lot more about us, and we hope to see you all at more programs. Thanks.
Oh, you were going to introduce
me.
Introduce myself.
I will. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you to the so my name is Stacy Toronto, and again, thank you to the Community Peace and Justice Forum, Emmanuel Church, and the NFRPP, and especially Rhoda. She and I have been working together to plan this talk since probably like last fall. So thank you so much for making that a pleasant experience and for having me here tonight. So I'll sort of tell you a little bit about myself.
One thing about Stacy.
Oh, sure.
She's an associate professor at Ramapo. She's the coordinator for the history program. She's written some important books, which you're going to hear about tonight.
That's important. Just one book so far.
By her book. And I think you'll find it very interesting and good program.
Thank you so much, Dawn.
Thank you. Thank you again. Yeah, so I'm here to talk to you tonight, and I'll get a little bit into my bio, but as Dawn was saying, I am a professor of history at Ramapo, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I came upon the topic of my one book so far. I also, there's a little bit of bio information in the sheet that was handed out, so I also am a contributor to Made by History at the Washington Post, so I'm always writing about these issues in the public sphere, if you don't want to read, sort of esoteric academic articles. Tonight I'm really talking about, the title is Feminism and Partisan Politics, and essentially I'm talking about the topic of my book, Kitchen Table Politics, Conservative Women and Family Values in New York, which came out in 2017 from University of Pennsylvania Press. The book began as my PhD dissertation at Brown University in 2006. So I always tell students or anyone interested in getting a PhD in history that you really better be in love with your dissertation topic, because the thing follows you for like at least a decade. This topic and I were in our lucky year 13 together, and I don't know, I could be giving these talks for years to come. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I came upon the topic, but if I had to encapsulate what it's really about, one major aspect of the book is looking at how, looking at the transition of the Democratic Party from the party of the New Deal and Great Society to a party that incorporated a lot of the new left social movements of the 60s and 70s into its official structure. And tonight we're going to be looking at some of the modern feminist movements, liberal feminism, less so radical feminism. And conversely, how in the same time period, the 1970s, the Republican Party went, I guess a lot of folks in this room might remember it, but my students don't have they cannot believe this, how the Republican Party went from the party of Rockefeller, which supported many of the aims of the modern feminist movement, including legal abortion, which they saw as perfectly consistent with their aims for a small state and individual rights, to the party of Ronald Reagan and conservative Republican ideology, conservative family values, if you will. So that is really at the center of the book, and I'll be talking about it tonight. Oh no, you don't want to speed past that. Sorry. So I thought I would start the talk, and I'm going to be mindful of timing because I literally lecture for a living, and I could talk about this forever, but I will be mindful, I guess the timing somewhere around 40 minutes, and then open it up to Q&A. I thought I would start the talk tonight in the very same manner in which I start the book, telling you how I came upon this topic, which I've kind of been married to in a sense for over a decade. So in 2003, 2004, I worked for John Kerry's presidential campaign in 16 states as a volunteer and then paid staff. And then as I was transitioning into the summer of 2004, where Kerry would become the official Democratic nominee, I got a position with the Democratic National Committee, which would be taking over the coordinated campaign after the election. And I was also planning to go to graduate school that fall. And I was really upset because I had been working on this campaign for almost 2 years, and I was going to have to leave to go to graduate school, but I figured, that's all right, I can sit out the last 2 months, and then Kerry will be president, and it'll be fine. I ended up having to work in Rhode Island because I was moving to Rhode Island for graduate school. And this is really not that long ago, 2004, but it was really the infancy of internet in politics. So it was a point in which the Democratic Committee was coming around to the fact that small dollar donations can add up, and maybe they should spend some time also soliciting small dollar donations, in addition to the big Wall Street fundraisers. But they weren't quite realizing you could do that online, so they were actually hiring young 20-somethings like me. This is me, oh no, they're not even looking at me. There I am at age 25 in 2004, and I know I totally look the same now, right? There I am working on the Kerry campaign, and they actually sent us out door to door to get these small contributions. Like, they really didn't come around to the whole internet thing yet. So that was my position, and I was going to go door to door. I did go door to door in Rhode Island the entire summer. So the assistant field director, I sort of mapped out the whole state, going door to door, and we were in a blue state because we were hoping to, milk it for cash, right? Small dollar donations. And I was intending upon starting graduate school that fall to write about women in World War II. I claimed I was going to write about that, and then everything changed for me that summer. First of all, that was the family values election, you may remember, where Republicans put a lot of initiatives against same-sex marriage on the ballot to drive people to the polls to vote against same-sex marriage and then vote for Republicans while they were doing so. And I had been in like Virginia and in different neighborhoods where I was encountering evangelical Christians and, during this family values moment. And, I sort of, that was hard. And so I thought, oh, I'm going to Rhode Island. It's going to be like so easy compared to that. And sometimes it was easy. We started to notice if there was like a Volvo or a Subaru in the driveway, we were totally getting money. We could just like mention that we were from the DNC and they were going to write us a huge check for like $50. Or conversely, we started to notice that in certain neighborhoods that were middle class, but maybe on the lower end of middle class, we'd be going door to door during the day, and we would encounter older women, maybe older but very healthy and viable, in their 60s, 70s, maybe even 80s, who would slam the door on our face. And these are Catholic women in the very Catholic state of Rhode Island. And, I thought it was rough going door to door in certain neighborhoods of Virginia in evangelical enclaves. This was a whole new level of doors slamming on my face. We started to notice, like, if we saw rosary beads hanging from the car rearview mirror, we were probably going to have a door slammed in our face because, of course, John Kerry was Catholic and supportive of legal abortion, which infuriated some very devout Catholics because they saw that as a betrayal of his Catholic background. So that gave me an idea. As I got to graduate school, I was very animated by this idea of why is family values code for, in effect, anti-feminism in part? And specifically, how did issues such as abortion drive that? After a summer of doors in my face, that was my animating question as I entered graduate school. And I started digging into the literature, and I found that scholars had written a lot about the family values, anti-feminist opposition in terms of evangelical Christians. And Catholics were always mentioned. I mean, they are the very fabled Reagan Democrats, right? Catholics who historically had voted Democratic, but who, starting around the 1970s, especially by the 80 election, would often swing to Republicans on the basis of cultural issues like abortion. And so this demographic of Catholic voters was written about in the literature, but no one had ever really done a deep dive on those Catholic voters who voted in even larger numbers. Most of the attention was on the men, sort of, did their factory close down? Who are these Reagan Democrats? A lot hadn't focused on Catholic women, yet among that demographic of Catholic family values voters, women aged 45 to 64 went to the polls most often. And they were mentioned in the literature, but no one had really interrogated, how is it that these women, very committed to issues of social justice and routing out poverty, that their church was also committed to, what made them decide to vote on an issue like abortion and abandon maybe like economic issues, right? And I saw that at the door in Rhode Island because our response when they would say, but he's Catholic, Carrie, how can I vote for him? He's against family values. We would launch into that economic piece. Yes, he's Catholic. He supports, anti-poverty programs such as. But we found that that economic message that they were on board with, that their church was on board with, it was submerged. What was more important to them were issues like abortion. So I really wanted to do a nice deep dive on Catholic women in my PhD dissertation, looking at how they came to be New Deal Democrats committed to issues of social justice and anti-poverty measures to conservative Republicans. So that's exactly what the book looks like, okay? So I had to find what, in history, you always have to find, the best thing to do is to find a local case study that's more manageable to study, that can speak more broadly to national trends. A micro history, if you will. So I decided to focus on the state of New York for a couple different reasons. One, I kind of wanted to live there, and I had to live there for a couple of years. I had been there before graduate school, so that was part of it. But actually, it turns out it's the best place to study the migration of the Democratic Party from the Party of New Deal to the party of modern feminism. After all, FDR, before he was president, cobbling together the New Deal coalition at the federal level, he was governor of New York, where he, a wealthy Protestant man, it was not assured that he would get Catholic votes, but he had cemented a loyalty between himself and Catholic voters in New York before he was able to gather the votes or attract the votes of Northern Catholics, who became a very crucial part of his New Deal coalition. He had done that in New York. New York was also 40% Catholic, so it offered a big base. You know, I wasn't just going to be talking about 3% of the population in this case study. And not only was it 40% Catholic, they were the most important swing vote in the state. So essentially, in every statewide election in this era, in the post-World War II era, whichever candidate won the Catholic vote in New York State won that statewide election. So this was all lining up to be a good place to study it. But even more so, if I'm looking at how it transitioned from the party of the New Deal to the party of modern feminism, New York State, and especially New York City, was in many ways the intellectual and political nucleus of modern feminism. By the way, and I know anyone who's really studied modern feminism, you know it's kind of a general. There were many movements, many diverse goals, largely focusing on what we might call liberal feminism, groups like NOW and NARAL, groups that engage in electoral politics. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say modern feminism. So this had been in a very important nucleus or center of modern feminism, and you could see in representatives of the Democratic Party like Bella Abzug, Shirley Chisholm in New York State, you could see the state party really migrating from that party of the New Deal to modern feminism really well in that state over the course of the 1970s. Meanwhile, on the other side, what better place to study the breakdown of the Rockefeller coalition than Rockefeller's home state? That was where he served as governor from 1959 until he was brought into the White House as VP under Ford. As governor of New York State in 1970, he very vigorously championed New York's state abortion reform law in 1970. New York State legalized abortion 3 years before Roe versus Wade, in what became the most expansive law in the nation. So most states had residency requirements. California, you could get an abortion. Ronald Reagan signed that bill in 1967 before abortion was part of the conservative agenda. But you had to be a resident of California to get an abortion there. So obviously establishing residency when you're on a tight time frame, it's not always possible. But New York State, with the backing of Rockefeller, had passed a bill in 1970 whereby there were no residency requirements. So New York became very much a center where women from all around the country would go to have legal and safe abortions. So you go from the Republican Governor Rockefeller and who ran the state party, championing many modern feminist political aims, the ERA, legal abortion, to 10 years later, Reagan makes it, I know, maybe I don't have to tell people in this room, but it's always a surprise to me or to my students that New York was perhaps the #1 swing state in the 1980 election. Of course, now we're never swing states in this area, right? But Reagan, with good reason, decided that if he could win the home of what had been moderate Rockefeller Republican politics, if he could win in the home state of Rockefeller, then conservatives would have fully triumphed over the moderate wing in their party. So his campaign manager came from New York, Bill Casey from Long Island. In fact, his entire Northeast coordinator was a New Yorker. You may have heard of him. His name is Roger Stone. He was, he's a New Yorker. So really like a real attention to New Yorkers in that 80 campaign because he's going after it vigorously in terms of leadership, etc. So imagine from 1970, the home of Rockefeller, where the state is supporting legal abortion because it's consistent with Republican affinity for individual rights in a smaller state, to 10 years later, it's the #1 swing state that the conservatives have set their eye on. So I just had to dig in, how did that happen? How did you get women from the New Deal coalition who were committed Catholics and interested in poverty and social justice, how do you get them leaving the party of the New Deal at the same time that feminists are coming into the party? And how do you get them going over to the conservative wing of the Republican Party, Hoover's old wing? These are FDR Democrats, the opposite of Herbert Hoover and conservatives. And as it turns out, issues like abortion and the modern women's movement was very crucial to that migration. The same sentiment I had seen at the doors in Rhode Island, women who voted, were willing to look past the conservative Republicans' ideas about poverty, which were very much the opposite of their own ideas about the need to tend to the poor, and look past that in favor of issues like abortion. This is where I was going to figure it out, I decided. Essentially, what I really looked at in this book and dissertation were women who lived in the suburbs of New York, and I'm going to explain how they go from New Deal Democrats living in the boroughs of New York City to suburban, eventually conservative Republican voters. Giving the talk in this area, you are familiar with the suburbs of New York. It's Nassau and Suffolk County, on Long Island, Rockland County, and Westchester County, right? Very familiar to us here. These suburbs explode after World War II with new white suburbanites who, backed by redlined mortgages from the GI Bill, are finally able to leave status as renters in the city and become suburban homeowners, right? And these are the families that the women I'm talking about come from. And the women I talk about who will become these family values Catholic women, they are first generation suburbanites. And this is very important, first generation homemakers, meaning they tended to be born around the 1930s in New York City. Their mothers worked, so did their fathers, to make ends meet during the Depression. They were generally grew up in ethnic neighborhoods that were everything was oriented around their parish, real cradle-to-grave system. They went to Catholic schools there. They probably lived in extended families. A lot of their grandmothers would watch them while their mothers went out to work. And they were told, of course, as women, that the goal is to be a homemaker. Well, and that was making it. Well, alas, after World War II, they have made it. And of course they think on their own, but really it's because their families are now considered white. Their husbands often serve in World War II or Korea, and a lot of them have GI mortgages that make it so that continuing to rent in the same Brooklyn neighborhood where they grew up. A lot of them grew up in Park Slope, which back then was not the Park Slope of today. It was an Italian working class Catholic neighborhood, not the fancy neighborhood of today. But a lot of them grew up in places like Park Slope, in these working class neighborhoods where their parents had pictures of, on the one hand, the Pope framed, and on the other hand, FDR. Because the New Deal was really theirs were the families that were being lifted out of the most dire aspects of poverty during the Great Depression because of these New Deal programs. And it's in this moment that the Catholic Church and the Democratic Party are so intertwined. A Pope writes an encyclical in the early 1930s. Basically, the Catholic Church had been concerned with anti-poverty measures for mostly its entire existence, but it really ramped up in the late 19th century with the onset of industrial capitalism, the Gilded Age, the first one, where you get incredible wealth, a hallowing out of the middle class, and then, immigrants working in the factories that are enriching men like Carnegie, who are becoming the nation's first billionaires. Starting in the 19th century, the Catholic Church became vigorously committed to routing out the worst vestiges of industrial capitalism and addressing poverty. Democratic Party was not paying attention. But when, in the midst of a global depression, the Democratic Party starts paying attention and starts to form an agenda that is really committed, just like the Catholic Church, to anti-poverty programs. So sometimes untangling, Catholicism and democratic politics in the 1930s in a place like New York, it's almost impossible. The church would build things only with unionized labor that Democratic Party leaders recommended. This was really their world. They were New Deal Democrats and they were Catholics, and what I'm kind of saying is that it's almost one and of the same. So that's their world, and a lot changes for them as they come of age. Their husbands are back to the GI mortgage. They're able to move to the suburbs along with other newly ascendant white middle class. It's the largest middle class our country will ever have in the post-war moment. About 60% of Americans are classified as middle class in the 1950s, but it's an engineered middle class. It's entirely white, expanded definition of who's white now. Now their families, these women, the Italians, Catholics, they are now considered white. So it's an entirely by design white middle class backed by mortgage programs that are inherent in the GI Bill. So these women move out of the cradle to grave neighborhood in places like Park Slope, where their entire life was oriented around democratic politics and the Catholic Church, and they find themselves often not knowing how to drive and suddenly living in suburbs like Levittown. Here they are. There's so many Catholics who move to these counties with their GI mortgages and other FHA mortgages that the Catholic Church doesn't know what to do. Here's a picture of a Catholic church, the mass that's being held in a tent on Long Island. There's the population, the Catholic Church can't keep up with the population of Catholics who are moving to these surrounding suburbs. And what you have is, these women who had this very cradle to grave system in the city. Suddenly they find themselves really isolated in the suburbs. Many of them don't know how to drive. They've arrived in the suburbs not needing to know how to drive, coming from the city. They're living in neighborhoods clustered together, homes very closely clustered together, and they don't know anyone. Gone is their support system, gone is the extended family, and what they do find themselves is home during the day with a community of women just like themselves. They just don't know them. So one woman described it as, it was like we transferred the city to Rockland County. I just didn't know any of them, but I knew them. We all have the same story. This is the beginnings. It's a very unsettling time for them, right? They're torn away from their support system, but they immediately look, of course, to the Catholic Church for some grounding, for something familiar. Except this is not the parish that they're used to in the city. They're in a tent. Compounding the problem, and this really their everyday family life, it's a little unnerving as they move to the suburbs. They don't know anyone, it's a new lifestyle, and even what should be familiar, the Catholic Church isn't. And this is kind of a primer for how they're going to anticipate modern feminism. They see this, they think of this as a disruption to everyday family life in the same way they're going to later talk about feminism. And I'll sort of unpack that a little bit for you. Because it's not just what they're contending with, or not just a population explosion of Catholics. The Catholic Church even has to create a new diocese of Rockville Center on Long Island. This is also the 1960s when they arrive in the suburbs, and it seems the whole Catholic Church to them has changed with the onset of Vatican II. Almost every daily routine that they knew in Catholic life has been transformed. They're used to Latin masses. It's now going to be in English. A lot of so the Vatican II was an attempt in the early 60s to modernize the Catholic Church, make it more updated with everyday life for modern citizens. So they reasoned most Catholics all across the world didn't speak Latin, so it didn't make sense to do the Mass in Latin anymore. There were all these devotional ceremonies that people just kind of did but didn't know why you were doing it. So they tried to replace it with community community groups like this, maybe in a Catholic church, where you would, be a member of a parish, and you would maybe have different activities with the parish members. You would talk about current events from the perspective of being Catholic, rather than just, doing devotional ceremonies to saints that no one really understood why they were doing it. So the women did not take this well. The women I was writing about, because it was just too unsettling for them. It was just too unsettling. Their lives had changed dramatically from city to suburb, and you layer this on top, all of a sudden there are all these new rituals that they have to do on the Sunday Mass that are different, and who do the Catholic priests reach out to teach their families how to perform in the new Mass? These women. So they feel like they are really like the person who has to bring this whole new Catholic lifestyle to their families, and they really feel like it's a gross disruption to everyday life. And the way, as I was saying, they will later talk about modern feminism as a disruption to everyday family life, is really informed by this experience. That is, they would say feminism was really bad, but before that, Vatican II was just as bad. So this really primed them to start thinking about defending institutions, traditional family institutions, and traditional family life. It was a good primer later on for feminism for them. Okay. Also, so it's unsettling, but there are some good things to living in the suburbs. For the first time, money isn't as big of a concern for them. So, though the Catholic Church talks a lot about a commitment to anti-poverty programs, poverty is really invisible to them by the time they're in the suburbs for a while. Everyone around them is a uniform middle class. They don't see poverty, and what they become committed to is this middle-class lifestyle. They feel like they've finally made it, okay? So there's some unsettling things going on. Even the familiar institution of the Catholic Church has changed. But on the other hand, they're surrounded by other first-generation suburbanites, other first-generation homemakers, and whereby their mothers had to work in the factories in the 1930s, they've finally achieved the American dream for their family as a housewife, okay? And that's really how they saw it. They saw it as a prize. So along comes, in their state, they're living in the suburbs of New York City. They get their TV they get their news from local news, which is New York City based. And as we're getting into the 60s and 70s, it's really a center of modern feminism. So all of a sudden, they're watching TV and they're watching Democrats, the party of the New Deal, is now being represented by the likes of Bella Abzug, Shirley Chisholm, and they start to get a little skeptical about their former Democratic Party, right? They were totally fine with the first major policy proposal that came into the news and into their lives, the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Because they said women belonged at home, but if they have to work, they should have equal pay for equal work. Remember, they're the daughters of, in many cases, factory workers, and they think it would have been nice if mom had been paid as well as dad. Of course, if you can make it like we have, that's the ideal, but if you have to work, you should have equal pay for equal work. And their Catholic Church is on board with that too. In fact, the Catholic Church supports equal pay for equal work if a family wage isn't attainable. So that is to say, if a male breadwinner cannot support the family, they would hope that women who do have to work have equal pay for equal work. So this is perfectly consistent, the first iteration of modern feminism, equal pay for equal work. Their church is on board, and they're on board. It's just not something they have to address because they've finally made it. But then along comes abortion, and they weren't paying attention to politics in the 1960s. They may have seen feminists on the TV talking about equal pay for equal work, but a lot of them are Catholics, young mothers. They have upwards of 7 children or more. They don't believe in artificial forms of birth control, just like their church. So, I mean, I don't know, I'm the mother of 2 young kids. I can relate to them not having time to watch politics or pay attention, really, because they're just busy. They were very busy, but they weren't too busy to find out about abortion as that came around. Sorry, I'm trying to get a handle on this. It's going a little too quickly for me. There we go. This is where I want to keep it. Okay, so remember I told you the Catholic Church had been trying to modernize itself with Vatican II, and the women didn't love it because it came at a time when they were just generally unsettled and craving some of that tradition. But as part of that, the Catholic Church had created community groups that were supposed to take the place of some of these rituals to different saints. And one parish on Long Island had decided to create a current events group. It was called a dialogue group, and it would be led by the Catholic priest at the parish, and he would talk during the day, which was convenient to him, to parishioners about events in the news and sort of have a discussion about how they should feel about these events as Catholics. Of course, this group meeting during the day, it largely attracted the women, and only the women I talked about, who would join this group, and that would be the basis for the New York State Right to Life party that they would form. Okay, so they find themselves other young mothers. Their children are generally of school age, so they might have 7 children, but they're all in school during the day. Just hit them sort of at that point in their life cycle. And they start meeting with this priest, and they find out that in New York State, the state legislature, this is the late 60s, is debating legalizing abortion. Now they see this as Catholics. Their church is telling them that this is akin to murdering someone out of utero. So they're opposed to it because they're sort of being led to believe it's murder by their church. But many of them feel sincerely that it is murder. These are women who their whole life was dedicated to full-time motherhood. That was seen as the prize for women. And the way that they're perceiving it is that this is something that is backed by people who want to stop women from becoming mothers. They see motherhood and full-time motherhood as the prize, and they believe that it's just too disorienting for the way that they think about motherhood and really themselves, right? This would potentially stop motherhood. And their church says it's murder. So they are against this for both, I think, personal reasons. It becomes clear when I've interviewed a lot of these women. By the way, this book is based on over 100 interviews with these women in New York State, and I got their names and contact information from Phyllis Schlafly, who is, of course, one of the leading anti-feminist leaders. Yes, she would. Imagine being a graduate student and having your first ever interview be with Phyllis Schlafly. So that's where I found myself in 2007. I was saying interviewing her in 2007 was no different than reading her anti-feminist newsletters from the 1970s. It was the same dialogue. However, what was incredibly helpful to her is she said, oh, you want to meet activists I worked with in New York State during the 1970s? Let me just open up the Eagle Forum database, the current one, and that's how I found these women. Approaching conservative family values, studying women's history at Brown is not probably going to get you anywhere, but when you say Phyllis Schlafly sent you, they actually answer your calls. So that's how I came about these 100 women. Okay, so I'm interviewing these women, and they're learning in the current events dialogue group about New York State legalizing abortion, which they're opposed to for both personal reasons and religious reasons. And they're very alarmed to find out that the party of the New Deal, that some of the leading Democrats in the state are coming on board with this. This has a lot to do with internal dynamics in the Democratic Party, but I don't want to get too into the weeds with this, but essentially in the late 60s you have a lot of young staffer, anti-Vietnam War young people who had joined Gene McCarthy's anti-war campaign, and they're furious that Humphrey ended up being nominated, who was sort of status quo in Vietnam. So at the convention, the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where everything was literally burning outside the doors of the building, you have these young staffers who say, how can we get different delegates in the room when it's the 1972 presidential election? We want delegates, not these old union bosses who like the Vietnam War because it's good for jobs. We want different delegates who are going to be against the Vietnam War. So they decide to change the rules in the Democratic Party, whereby 10% of the country is African American. They decide 10% of the delegates should be African American. They look at different demographics and they do it along that lines, knowing that men who are not white were disproportionately impacted by the draft. And so if you get more delegates who are less white, they would potentially in 72 not nominate a pro-war Humphrey. They also thought that women are 51% of the population, but these were young guys, and they said, "Ooh, that would be too much to have 51% of the delegates be women. So we'll have 30% be women." And so on. The whole idea was women must be against the war because they're for peace. And so, this would be a way not to get a Humphrey-like figure nominated in 1972. Well, that meant by 1972, by the 70s, the Democratic Party was trying to bring more women, at least 30%, into the party. And the only women in politics then, this is before Schlafly got organized, were feminists. Well, if 30% of your party is essentially, of your leadership is going, in delegate base, are going to be women, and the only women in politics in that era are feminists, this is how the Party of the New Deal starts to become the party of modern feminism. The Republican Party doesn't really have the same internal dynamics that is openly welcome women into the party. Okay? But like I said, the Republican Party was on board with many of the aims of modern feminism because of their penchant towards individual rights and small government, which you see most clearly in the abortion debates. So these women are looking, they're sitting in this dialogue group and they're realizing that their party of the New Deal is starting to welcome feminists who support legal abortion into it. And as one woman said, quoting an obscure author, "We were supposed to be the party that distributed hats, not cut off heads." That's how she put it, seeing that transition. Pretty dramatic quote, right? Meanwhile, they were not happy with the Republicans in the state because at the time of the 1970s, the Republican Party was led by Rockefeller, who also supported legal abortion. So they start this dialogue group in their church, and they go off and eventually form the New York State Republican Right to Life Party. Okay? And their idea is they start running candidates for election, not because they think they can win, but they're trying to show both the Democratic and Republican parties that there's a very viable anti-abortion swing vote in the state to try to move them in that direction. Okay? They're not winning races, but they see themselves as potentially shifting the dialogue. At least that's the hope for many of them. So these women are sort of without a party, without a home in either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And along comes, they finally find someone who is interested in partnering with them, the conservative wing of the Republican Party in New York State, which have been out of power since Hoover. And Rockefeller literally dominates the party. His form of moderate politics forms it, and moderate Rockefeller Republicans are supporting legal abortion and modern feminism. But conservatives really are based, I'm going to show you a map of the state. Here. Essentially the way that partisan politics worked in this era, the 1960s, 1970s in New York State, is you have the major population center, New York City, which is mostly dominated by the Democratic Party and moderate Republicans, and they sort of fight for space in New York City. Meanwhile, upstate New York, which is actually every single county except those 4 suburban ones I talked about and New York City, the 5 counties of New York City, that's all considered upstate, whether it's Orange County, New York, or actual upstate. And it was sparsely populated, and that's where conservative Republicans had their base. Of course, there weren't that many voters, so they were in, even though it was a large geographic portion, and so they were largely out of influence in the state. They were looking to finally take over influence from the moderates. right there in Rockefeller's home district. So they looked to the suburbs, the growing suburbs of New York City, where you have this influx of activism led by Catholic women against issues like abortion. And they said, I know how we can get a population base in this state. Let's link our conservative politics to this growing anti-feminist politics. And you see that happening in the state. If we can win over voters that these women are organizing, then we might have a chance of actually not only minimizing the moderates in our state, but because these counties are so populous, we might even win a statewide election. And it's sort of in this moment that those like Reagan are looking to New York State as a swing state, as I was saying, because they see that conservatives are linking their politics to this new family values coalition. Remember, conservatives had at first been supportive of policy aims of the feminist movement. Ronald Reagan himself did legalize abortion as governor of California in 1967. Again, they saw this as perfectly, just like moderate Republicans saw feminist aims like legal abortion as perfectly consistent with Republican ideology, so too did conservative Republicans. They were for the ultimate in a small state. They were vigorously for individual rights, both which mesh well with the orientation toward the pro-choice orientation, right? Of a woman should decide, not the state. So conservatives at first were, okay with feminist aims, but when they saw that right there in the heart of Rockefeller's New York, women were organizing who had left the Democratic Party and were organizing against abortion. They decided that we could just marry our politics to their politics and actually win votes. That's how you get this kind of odd coalition of small government conservatives who are for big government in terms of issues like abortion, having the state sort of decide versus an individual woman. It's an odd marriage, but it's a marriage of political convenience that you really see starting to first take shape in a place like New York State in the 70s, thanks to the activism of these women. And it becomes family values conservatism. Again, why are they interested in this? I mean, not only are they opposed to abortion, but just generally they perceive modern feminism as antithetical to their lifestyles, right? I told you that they had seen being a homemaker. They were first generation suburbanite, first generation homemaker. They saw that as the prize. And right when they had achieved that prize that their mothers and their working class grandmothers had always hoped for, from their perspective, along came modern feminism with language about a choice. A woman should be able to choose, should she stay at home or should she go out into the paid workforce? They felt that by advocating a choice, you were in effect diminishing the choice to stay at home, because if it really were the ultimate prize as they saw it, why would you need a choice, right? Basic supply and demand, more choices, less value to any one single choice, right? So it was not just abortion, but it was just in general this idea of making women more competitive outside of the home that didn't sit right with them. And as conservative Republicans sort of spoke to that as a ploy to get their votes, the votes that they were organizing, they started to find a home in the Conservative Party. And so by 1980, as I was saying at the beginning, you end up with a Republican Party, that is looking to finally rout out the last vestiges of pro-feminist, moderate Rockefeller Republicanism right there in Rockefeller's home state. Of course, Rockefeller passed away in 1979, but it was still his state party. And it's this calculus that sets Reagan's campaign sights on New York State in 1980, and as I said, even is behind his decision to appoint prominent New Yorkers to his campaign staff. So maybe I'll just leave it. So that's really the transition that you really see in my book, this narrative of the women first observing their party of the New Deal becoming the party of modern feminism. that making them feel like they no longer have a home in that party, and not at first looking to the Republican Party, which was dominated by moderate, pro-feminist Rockefeller Republicans, but seeing this sort of marginal conservative force welcome them into their arms in this sort of tenuous, not natural coalition, but one that ultimately allows Reagan to win the state, not once but twice. And ever since then in New York, and I said this is a case study that speaks to broader trends, these are the voters that were called Reagan Democrats. They're the voters that switch parties in any one given election, and they, and especially women, like in this book, the demographic 45 to 64, because those are the folks who go to the polls, women in that age bracket, more than any other voters in America, they really have become the coveted swing vote in national elections, federal elections, and below, right? Sometimes we call them the soccer moms today. Lots of different labels, but this is sort of the origin point of that. So again, I'm happy to take your questions. I look forward to it. And if you're interested in the book, because my publisher would be very upset if I did not say this, I do have some coupons from University of Pennsylvania Press for 20% off, or if you'd like the even deeply discounted author rate, you can buy it for $35. You can leave your contact information there, your name, how many you want, and your email, and I can get it to you in the Bridgewood area. Thank you, everyone.
Do we have some questions?
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. Quick question. I know you did not address this, and I don't know if you do so in your book, but during the era that you're focusing on, I'm wondering if you could possibly speak to gay women and women of color, in particular, those two who were not able to transition from inner cities to the suburbs.
No, yeah, absolutely. So the women I write about would say that this is about larger issues that have nothing to do with race, but the point I really underscore in the book is this is a completely racialized politics, right? What are they advocating for? They're advocating for what they call the traditional nuclear family, this idea that women are in the home and men with a male breadwinner, right? Although they don't directly address race, given that this option was only largely available, especially in the post-war moment, for white heterosexual couples, right? Just basically they found themselves advocating for a form of politics that was largely only available to white people, right? They like to say things, they would often say to me, well, this is completely colorblind, we would take anyone in there, but in this moment in particular, they are advocating for an option that is only really available to white people. Now, it's an expanded definition of who's white in the post-war moment, right? Like, a lot of them are Southeast European ancestry, folks who were not considered white. But, throughout the New Deal, and especially with the GI Bill, when their husbands were able to qualify for it, and when they were able to qualify for those FHA mortgages in redlined suburbs, that was when their families officially became white. So it's a deeply racialized politics, and it's one that is predicated upon heteronormative nuclear family, absolutely. So yeah, this politics would exclude women in those groups, absolutely.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation. I guess as I sit here and think about that era, I grew up in the 50s in southern Bergen County, which had its share of people from New York. And most of the families I knew did not have 7 children, and they were Catholic. I was not, but the community certainly was. So, as with this whole argument that's been co-opted by Phyllis Schlafly's group and beyond, it seems to me, well, I actually want to know, did you in any way speak about birth control? I mean, in the 60s, of course, birth contraceptives became
Right.
possible. And, there was a big push on that. And I would also suspect that many of the women you spoke to either had or knew somebody who had an abortion and never discussed it. The whole issue, in my opinion, has been totally co-opted by the other side. So the 1 out of 3 women who have had abortions are not, very few of them are doing the shout out your abortion.
Oh, yeah, I mean, they certainly would never admit that to me by any means. The women I interviewed largely were very devout Catholic women, so there's sort of a spectrum of women. These would be women who are, attending the priest's weekly dialogue group, right? All of them, at least as they presented it to me, one, they're from the middle class, but comfortable enough in the middle class status that they didn't at least ostensibly engage in family planning. They did not believe in birth control, which was largely at first only available to married women like themselves, because they saw that as against the Catholic Church's wishes. They certainly, probably a lot of these women have not had abortions, but I am sure that, these are the same. If for them, maybe they never came into their worldview, but maybe they would decide differently if it were based on them, right?
They wouldn't have told you.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't have told me. But a lot of them actually, the central organizers, I don't know, they had upwards of 10 children, so I'm gonna guess they didn't. But what's very interesting is that they often come from families that are 1 or 2. I would say their mothers would have been much more likely, and they would never tell me about that. I mean, their mothers were really living on the edge of poverty, and being pregnant was grounds for being fired. In many cases, their parents, not only were their mothers working, they might have been the sole breadwinner because women found employment more readily in the in the 1930s and the Depression than men, because you could pay women less. So if you could hire a woman, you hired a woman. So I would definitely say that it's definitely possible that their mothers engaged in family planning or had an abortion, but I think for them, the ability to have, at least what I've sensed from all these interviews, the ability not to control family planning, right, the ability to have upwards of 10 children, was seen for them as another status marker of having finally arrived in the middle class. It was sort of baked into this identity as first-generation suburbanites, first-generation middle class. It was something they were proud of, that they could do that. So, I don't know if that, certainly they wouldn't tell me if they had, but I would bet if anyone in their family had an abortion, it was most certainly their mothers. Their mothers at least had to have had different ideas about birth control, right?
Hi, I'm going to piggyback on that because that was my question as you were talking. Did you in any way in your questions actually ask that talk about, did you know anyone who had an abortion? So that was one of your questions.
Oh yes, but these are the women who are not only not having abortions, they're the women on the picket line outside the clinic, right?
I mean, they had to know someone. I mean,
presumably, absolutely.
If they came from anywhere in that area,
I would say absolutely.
They had to know.
They had to have known.
Raped, someone who had an abortion because of rape. They had to know someone.
I would say it's probably impossible to go through your life and not know someone who's had an abortion. But I would venture to say, in their world, their closest friends were the other founders of the New York State Right to Life Party. Right, in the moment that their politics really shifts, they become political and switch allegiances from the party of the New Deal to the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Their whole lives and social circles are surrounded by other women like them, right? These first-generation homemakers, suburbanites. I'm sure they must have known someone, but they certainly wouldn't be. It was really seen as not just antithetical to their beliefs about family, their beliefs about religion, but really it was a marker of identity as much as it was, buying the latest car with a tail fin, right? The ability to walk around and to have 10 children, unlike their mothers, and to stay home full time was a status symbol for many of them. And it's because they had clinched that they had such a, although feminists, liberal radical are very much talking about choice. And in fact, it's groups, feminist groups like National Organization for Women who actually pass the laws that help homemakers, right? Because they were oriented around choice. If you want to stay at home, we want to pass laws that will make you as successful as a homemaker as possible. If you want to work in the paid workforce, then we want to pass laws that will make that as easy for you and as fair for you as possible. So feminists are very much talking about choice and talking about how they're not opposed to homemakers, but these women, despite that language, these women perceive it. Just, you're offering a choice? That must mean that my prize is less valuable. That's how, they don't even listen, in other words. Oh, sorry, maybe I must have.
I just had a question. I grew up in northern Bergen County, up in Ramsey area, and I am a product of that, group. And I remember the parents and everything being very upset that the Catholics came from the city and came into the suburbs. Mm-hmm. So did they feel that hatred? I mean, because it got to some point where it was, and they segregated themselves because the priest said, you cannot, like Girl Scouts, girls could not go in a Protestant church for a service.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so was that felt? I mean, did these women talk about, that's another way they were isolated.
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
The suburbs.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, given just where they're coming from and where they're going, the types of suburbs they're migrating to are sort of further up. They're not like the bedroom communities closest to the city where more affluent suburbanites first settled in the 1920s. They're settling in places that was farmland until the GI Bill after World War II. So they're in a different kind of suburb that tended to be first-generation suburbanites, or if they're in a suburb that's more established bedroom community like a Ridgewood, they would be in the section of the new post-war, right, post-war development. So, so they find themselves, just because of economic factors and when they arrived in the suburbs, being with other folks that were like them, and then segregating themselves, right? Not sending their children to public schools, sending them to Catholic schools oriented around the parish. Again, it's very disorienting for them in this new world. They want at least their children to have some semblance of the same education they had in the city, right? So they really lead these insular lives where they're in the suburbs, they're not engaging with the full suburb, but just really with their Catholic community.
Right. I mean, for us, I never went to school full-time because of the population explosion of children, not till I was in 6th grade. And in the Catholic schools, there were 2 kids in a seat, 50 kids in a classroom. So that, again, was a whole different dynamics as far as we know. But just as an example, an experience of the shame of having an abortion, this was in 1972. I had just gotten married, so I became the cover for a high school friend who came up from the South to have an abortion in New York,
right?
And stayed at my house so nobody knew. And another friend and I drove her to the hospital, picked her up, and literally that same day just got her on a plane to go back home. But to this day, as high school friends, I don't think anybody else in the group knows except the 2 of us who were.
Right. And in 1972, if you encountered picketers outside the clinic, these are the women I'm talking about, right? Because when New York State legalized abortion in 1970, their activism in these growing populous suburbs was responsible for the New York State legislature repealing that law 2 years later in 1972. It was, so basically they had pushed lawmakers who had passed the nation's most expansive abortion reform law in 1970 by getting involved in politics, making their presence known with their third-party activism. They were able to push lawmakers to overturn the abortion law just 2 years later. Of course, it was saved by Governor Rockefeller's veto pen, and it was preserved, and then the next year kind of became a moot point because the Supreme Court weighed in at the federal level, so state protections were no longer all that people had. So these were the women. They were not only I would venture to say not having abortions themselves, but probably knowing someone, at least in their earlier years, who did. They are on the front lines. They were at clinics in that 1970 to 1972 period, pushing the state legislature to outlaw abortion.
This lady over here's got a, no, this lady over.
How are you? Good. It was a great talk. I wanted to see, like, how do your thoughts and perceptions change from when you wrote this book to today? Obviously, the political climate is very different today than it was even 6 months ago.
Right.
So, I mean, what do you see the state of what we're in now and where we're going? And where would you like to see it go?
Well, where I'd like to see it go is not where we are today, personally. But what I will say that this I really uncover in the book is, you know, people look at, you know, let's say Trump, a very unpopular president. The voters I'm talking about and, you know, going forward to today, they are so committed to issues like keeping abortion illegal that they will vote for someone who maybe offends them on a variety of levels, you know, indifference to the poor, but even more so, you know, things that even the Pope, the head of their church, is opposed to, right? But that's how central issues like abortion became in their lives. So I think that in terms of today, the voters of today who you wonder, you know, how can abortion really triumph over everything? How can this family values politics triumph over everything else that they presumably believe in? This is really what I'm talking about. This kind of gets at it, because a lot of this is not just about partisan politics for them, the who's up and the who's down, sort of horse race aspect of it. They see it as it's religious to them, but it's really like integral to their personality. To not vote with these issues at the forefront would be to put aside something that they have oriented their entire adult lives around, this commitment to, say, full-time motherhood or something like that. So I think that in terms of today, it really helps explain how someone could continue along with a politician that they really are opposed to, just for the promise that he would appoint conservative judges who would potentially outlaw Roe versus Wade. So that's it really gave me a window into that type of politics, which I think a lot of people sort of struggle to understand today, right? Like, but he's committed crimes. Yeah, this is why, because to not vote for someone who could, say, overturn abortion is to almost vote against who they see themselves as, right? Like a commitment to their own identity.
Just one moment. A number of us have lived through this period, but I noticed that we have some younger folks here who have not. And I'm wondering if any of them would want to talk about what they find about your research surprising, or if there are any concerns that they may have, you know, about, you know, the revocation of Roe versus Wade, or some of the other, you know, family values, things that are going on right now. And I don't mean to embarrass any of you, but you might take it.
First of all, when you opened, it sounded like you were talking about today, with the tiny middle class and everything.
Oh, yeah.
And I can certainly see why they would vote for somebody who was otherwise despicable. Because I would never vote for somebody who was anti-choice.
Right.
I just wouldn't do it. And you were saying before that the New York State's law was virtually moot until now.
Well, right, yes. Living so close to New York, many of us will feel fortunate to live so close, because presumably that law will be what we can rely on, maybe? If it's over.
I'm going to go now.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Hi, I've been patiently waiting. So I guess I'm the token young person in the room. My grandmother was a flapper. And she worked, and like you were talking about, a lot of men couldn't get jobs, but they would pay the woman less.
Right.
And as a young child, you know, I saw the fur coats and the parties, she had pictures and everything else, and I thought she was such a cool woman. She had my mother very late, and as I grew up, I didn't understand politics, I was a young child. My mother was a hippie, so she was literally the now woman, and my grandmother, the flapper, became this conservative suburbia housewife, right?
Oh, interesting, yeah.
And it's funny, it all makes sense as you're talking, but as a young college woman, I was like, wow, I have like two activist women in my life, so it's very interesting to see, like, you explained it so well, how it went from one end to the other. It was a very nice job. My second point I wanted to make, now there's so many more questions I have because as other people talk,
Read the book.
But, history repeats itself, which I think someone else mentioned. Affordable housing is like a big deal right now in Bergen County, and it's the same argument. It's the same argument. We're colorblind in here, our areas are colorblind. Everyone is allowed to come in. Well, no, only certain people can get this affordable housing, which is through the GI Bill at that time.
Right.
Now there's only certain people here that can live comfortably in our suburbia areas.
Yeah.
So I wish the political leaders and people working on these programs would learn more about this because they probably don't know the history themselves.
Right. Yeah, now, we fight a lot about it in this community, right? Because it's actually in this era where middle-class identity gets cemented to single-family home ownership, and that becomes racialized, right? It becomes where white people live in the suburbs in single-family homes, and multi-family housing becomes associated with the cities and pockets of poverty. In other words, those people who didn't qualify for the ability to move to the suburbs. So now we talk about things like high-density housing as code for like multi-family is code for non-white, right? So it's a very much a racialized politics that first gets cemented in people's everyday imaginations in this moment, right? As we're creating a suburban middle class predicated upon single family home ownership in the suburbs that happens to be completely racialized, only open to white people, right? Oh. Yeah, okay, sorry. I think someone's coming around with the mic.
We're coming around.
And speaking from another young person's perspective here, what really struck me that was interesting about your presentation here is we saw a quick change, not a quick change, but a 10-year change from the party of Rockefeller to the party of Reagan so quickly in such a partisan shift. And nowadays it seems like it's so much harder for people to shift their opinion or to really swallow their pride and say like, I'm going to move on to a different idea or to move to a different party. So I was wondering if you had any opinions on what it would take to actually take people like myself, who I even find myself being closed off to one perspective, what would it take for people like myself to really take that leap into other opinions and things like that?
I mean, what you have to realize is that so in this era where you have this big migration from Democrats to Republicans, this is also like seen as the heyday of nonpartisanship. That is to say that moderate Republicans were not so different than Cold War Democrats, right? So people knew people who migrated a lot more readily, right? Now, the conservative Republicans are different than moderate Republicans, right? But just the idea that you might vote as a Democrat one election and a Republican the next one was a much more common practice. And I think that even these women, as they moved, they were New Deal Democrats in the city, but upon moving to the suburbs, they had already, before women's issues became political, they were from families that did vote for sometimes moderate Republicans, right? Because it was better on property taxes or something like that, but only slightly different. So they have a drastic shift from New Deal Democratic Party to the conservative wing of the Republican Party, but you have to realize the context for that. They're living in a world where, it doesn't seem that odd to just like pick the D or the R, and kind of switch. The story, as I always tell classes, right, of the decades after World War II is the Democratic Party moving leftwards around issues like modern feminism, and conservatives taking over the Republican Party and moving rightwards. I guess this is my right. And so it's not
occupying that center as readily, right? So today we're living with the result of that hyper-partisanship whereby like it seems you're less likely to know someone who would migrate so readily. So that's important context for it, but I really appreciate your question.
Now I'm going to ask you to try some speculation here. In 16, your model held the suburban white women,
yeah.
Voted.
Yeah.
Now, that's boomers. And boomers are now a smaller generation than millennials.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So they're dying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore, we now have a lot of other suburban women, white suburban women in 18 did not vote Republican.
Yeah.
So what can you kind of speculate and comment on about that shift? Maybe, maybe not everyone did that, but there was a very significant shift in white suburban women's voting patterns. So would you speculate for us?
I mean, they really have been a swing demographic, right? Like since the 70s, and when they vote Republican in statewide and federal elections, that Republican wins. When they vote Democratic, these are some of the same. The women I'm talking about are sort of the most hardcore, the harder edge of this, who really once conservatives start talking about their issue, anti-feminism and abortion, they never leave the Republican Party. But just that demographic in general, people who are less tethered to maybe an issue like abortion, they are and have been since the 70s, the swing demographic, right? Sometimes. At the federal level, like Clinton won them and won the White House twice, right? Obama won them and won the White House twice, right? And you saw that in 18, right? What I want you to understand is that they're sort of, they migrated that demographic from Democrat to Republican over the course of the 70s, but the women I'm talking about are the leaders of that movement. They stayed firmly entrenched. But others who maybe not organized the campaigns, but maybe attended their rallies or, probably didn't even knock on doors for them, right? But maybe voted after a woman like this in the book came to their house. That's who you're kind of talking about. And they are open for persuasion, at least historically. And again, in 18, you saw that, right?
I just want to get back to the question about abortion and if anyone knew someone. 50s, 60s, birth control, you had that. That's why there wasn't that big concern among these women. They more than likely, Catholic or no Catholic, they practiced birth control. So they didn't know, and they still do in a great percentage. So even if they're against abortion, it's still practiced. So in that sense. But getting back to your study, when you did the study, did you take into consideration that I know where I grew up, there were other people that I went to school with from other religions, other non-Christian, who were Orthodox and were anti-abortion vehemently. Perhaps they didn't have this right to life, but what about those people who also moved into the suburbs? How did their politics change? Because there were many who did, and they weren't Catholics.
So nationally, evangelical Christians, Catholics, Orthodox Jews are all very important in this family values coalition. But as I was sort of saying, when you embark upon a PhD dissertation, you have to write about what no one else has ever written about. And a lot of people had written about, especially evangelical Christians, so I endeavored to write about Catholic women because no one had written about them. So I had to find a state where they dominated the Family Values Coalition.
Evangelicals, I'm talking about Orthodox Jewish.
Yeah, so right. But so I was trying to put the spotlight on Catholic women in this Family Values Coalition, so I purposely chose a state where they were the biggest demographic, where I would train my analytical lens, right? In New York State, they do make overtures to Orthodox Jews, and even to a very small base of evangelicals upstate who had long voted conservative Republican, but just in terms of sheer numbers, Catholics dominate the Family Values Coalition in New York, not nationally, but again, I was trying to specifically write about their story because it had been undercovered in the literature about family values politics. And especially in New York State, some of the biggest Orthodox communities in their era, maybe, eventually you would have a large population migrate into, say, Rockland County, New York, but that didn't happen in the 70s, this moment of transition that I was talking about. So most Orthodox Jews remained in the city where their votes were kind of watered down. They weren't as big of a population there that their vote could be influential, in other words. Mm-hmm.
Could you speculate on how the condition of the Catholic Church today and essentially the foundation of some of these women and their children, their daughters or whatever, their beliefs were based on a foundation for a religion that is having so much struggle and internal struggle, and what that could do to people who are staunchly in favor of these particular rules and believe that the people that were telling them these things were to be believed and truthful and honorable. And
yeah, I mean, again, like a lot of these women filtered it through their own perspective. So, when the priest that was first made them aware of legal abortion was maybe later found to have himself done something that they would see as highly unethical, abused children, or something, if that happened, right? They had sort of moved beyond that infrastructure, right? Like, this is a very personal story for them. They're first introduced to it by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church enables their political groups to grow. But this politics is really personal to them, right?
Beyond the hypocrisy.
Right, so they would say, well, no, they would say that's not everyone, or, that's not, we're all concerned about life and issues like that, right? So, yeah, they're not interrogating that at all, I would say, because again...
But even foundationally, the church supported these people. So it's not even just the people, it's the institution. That's what I'm wondering about, is how that doesn't rock your faith.
Yes, but in terms of their politics, so I didn't really look at I looked at their Catholicism as an identity that influenced their politics,
Well,
not
so
like
my question is, can you speculate on how that might serve their future generations? Whether that would change that feeling?
Well, what I'll say, and I saw Rhoda had asked this earlier, what about their children? Their children's politics actually are very different than these women that I'm talking about, right? Like, a lot of these women could not go to college because it's harder to go to college as a woman. They were coming from these impoverished families in the depths of the Great Depression as they're coming of age. Their children grew up middle class in the suburbs, go to college more readily. They can even remortgage those homes that they own, as opposed to these women whose parents didn't have that opportunity to send them to college. Their daughters were much more likely to engage in professional work outside of the home and to attend church less frequently than their mothers. But most of them, according to their mothers, vote for family values conservatives, but I would maybe think otherwise. Having met one of the daughters of the activist at an academic conference and getting to know her, I would say her mother might not know everything about her politics. This is very, their children grow up very differently than these women, right? It's the ability to choose whether to work in the home or work outside of the home. It's much more readily available to them. They don't, right? They don't see it. They're not being raised from birth to see homemaking as the ultimate prize, and many of them don't defend it as readily.
It seems to me like more of the evangelistic believing people have taken up the torch on this. Whereas maybe less people are participating in Catholicism, the evangelicals are taking their place.
Yeah, I think so I'm talking about the most devout Catholics that are in the Family Values Coalition that, they're an important part of it, but again, they're not the whole coalition. The evangelicals are a very sizable part, but because of evangelicals having an almost even greater presence on the national stage, so many scholars had written about them. So I was just trying to write about the 40% of that coalition that you don't hear from. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of the coalition, right? Absolutely.
I think there was a swing too, a swing backward, because we didn't have an evangelicals for choice group, but there was certainly Catholics for a free choice.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there were, yeah.
You know, and that, a lot of them are New York.
Yeah.
In your talk to these women, did they feel, or I mean, their family values, but talking more about abortion, that came from the priest and from their religion.
Mm-hmm.
Did they get it that this is separation of church and state? Seriously, so that did that even come into their thinking at all? Because when Kennedy ran,
right,
people in Bergen County thought
they loved Kennedy.
No,
These women.
Catholics did.
Yeah, these women loved
But
Kennedy, yeah.
the Protestants all thought the Pope was going to really become president, and were terrified of that.
Which is ridiculous.
Of course, but I'm just saying, that's how, you get influenced by these thoughts. So, my thinking, my question then is, and if I'm articulating it right, is that, did these women even understand that their point of view was crushing other people's point of views?
So this is a funny thing, since their politics...
Because it's a health issue.
Yeah. It's funny because even though their politics is completely oriented around issues like abortion, they don't actually view it as a partisan issue. They view it as something that is so concrete and clear, it's just right and wrong. And basically, though, as they see it, is that politicians are actually offering women the ability to do something that's so clearly wrong. And as they talk about it, we as full-time housewives and homemakers, it's so bad, the current political moment, as they would see it in the 70s, that they had to get involved to try to, so they weren't trying to push their religion on others. They just saw this as a clear issue of right and wrong, and politics had been so corrupted that politicians were supporting what they saw as wrong, and so they wanted to just temporarily enter politics to fix it and then recede back, is sort of how they saw it. So they don't even see it as I'm trying to have my choice usurped. They're just like, something really wrong has happened that I have to get off the sidelines, is how they kind of bring it.
My question, I'm sorry, I have a question. One quick question, and it's about, we do have a good sprinkling of men in this audience, and there's been not one question, and I don't think you addressed, unless you did before I arrived, on the issue of spouses and husbands, because I suspect that many of these women would not vote other than how their husbands are chosen.
Oh, yeah.
So for these women, actually, to them, their husbands. Yeah, their husband. I mean, these women are activists, right? And their husbands really aren't political activists, but as they see it, the situation has devolved so that politicians are supporting a potential end to motherhood, that they need to step off the sidelines and husband be damned because this is an issue that they have authority. See, it's this odd thing. They have no political experience. They really don't. She's saying it very well. She is. They have no political experience, these women, right? But they feel like they are the central authorities on an issue that has now become political. They would say, and they have said, that I don't care what my husband says because this is about motherhood. My husband might know about traditional old world politics, about taxation and foreign policy. I'm a woman, I don't know anything about that, they did say, right? But now, something that I do know about, motherhood, has become political. So now I'm the expert, because I'm a mother. That's how they saw it. So, and their husbands just didn't have the time to engage in this full-time political work.
That's a big point, you know, like,
If they don't have the time to engage, and the women do,
yeah,
then that makes a big point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, their husbands they're not taking cues from the husbands really, they just don't have time. But again, like these women say that, okay, now politics has changed, we're talking about motherhood. I can talk now about politics. My husband doesn't know about motherhood, right? So that's how they saw it, right? They saw it as an issue of right and wrong that impacted mothers, and they were mothers who supported the right.
Their first voice.
This is really where they come into their voice, absolutely. Again, this is their first political endeavor, and they say they're the experts.
I have a question. I grew up in the area I think that you studied. I was actually the first house I lived in was in Levittown.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Plainview, Hicksville,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, that whole area. Our Lady of Mercy Church.
Yep.
Yeah. But, so my question is, did you find that there were clusters around specific parishes of activists? Because in Plainview where I grew up, I really don't remember, and I wouldn't, you know, I probably would be too young to be aware, but I really don't remember that kind of activism among my friends, you know, whose mothers attended church regularly.
Yeah. So, of all the parishes in New York State, it's one in Merrick, Long Island, not too far, but Merrick. That's where that dialogue group is formed, that eventually becomes the New York State Right to Life Party. By the way, one of them even ran for president in 1976, Ellen McCormick. I have a whole chapter on her. I wrote about her recently for the Washington Post, but she even ran for president in the 1976 Democratic primary because she was appalled that all the candidates except for Jimmy Carter were getting on board with legal abortion, because that's the first presidential election after Roe versus Wade, so it's all of a sudden a political issue. So these women who would even dare to run for president, they're coming out of Merrick, Long Island, and in general, they're coming out of parishes in places that are, you know, new communities, new suburbs. So some of it's in Plainview, but in your neck of the woods where you grew up, Merrick was really the center. So if you were one of these women in Plainview, you would have just driven to Merrick to join them because it was close enough.
But I have one other question. Do you see any parallels between those women and women progressive activists now who got activated after the 2016?
Yeah, absolutely. So my second book project, next year's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women getting suffrage. So I'm editing a collection called Suffrage at 100, Women in American Politics Since 1920. And so one of our essay contributors is talking about the women after 2016 who organized and even decided to run for office, suddenly become involved in politics, and many of them ran. Yeah, and I always thought Allie Hartman did. Similar story over there too, before she left. But you know what? There is a complete parallel. Definitely, it's on the other side, but it's this idea of I've never had time for politics. I've never been involved in politics, but things have gotten so bad that I need to get off the sideline because no one will. Like this orientation, things have gotten so bad that they're arguing to get rid of motherhood legally. A mother must get off the sidelines. That's what they were saying. You see that same language, and specifically in this essay that will be in the collection, you know, this idea that I have to get involved because if not me, who? Someone has to stop this. That same energy, direct parallel, different issues, different side of the aisle. And you know, a lot of what these women were doing, standing outside shopping centers at busy times, handing out leaflets, the same thing's happening just on social media today, right? Like, total parallel. Yep. Real grassroots up. Those at the top, which you see, you know, the 18 elections, now you see a lot of the things people ran on in 18, attracting the attention of, say, the 2020 presidential candidates in the Democratic side. Same.
How do you see the Equal Rights Amendment and the flow of feminism from one party to the other?
Right. So these women were also opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment because Phyllis Schlafly told them if it passed, it would make it impossible to ever outlaw abortion, right? And they, of course, you know that in the 70s it was defeated in part by saying that it would compel homemakers into the paid workforce so that they could be equal to men. Of course, those supporters of the ERA said, no, the Equal Rights Amendment could not compel women against their will into the workforce. That would be called slavery, forcing someone to work against their will. We already outlawed that with the 13th Amendment. But, you know, they were opposed to it because they felt like this Equal Rights Amendment would force them out of the home and make it impossible to outlaw abortion, right? You know, the ERA had largely been supported by the ERA at first. The Equal Rights Amendment had been, unions didn't historically like it, because they thought it would take away a lot of the protections they had won for women. So historically, Democrats, the modern party of unions, the party of New Deal that created a lot of the unions, they were against the ERA. And Republicans, who were historically anti-union, unions didn't like the ERA, anti-union folks liked the ERA. So the Republicans generally liked the ERA, and then as conservatives took over the Republican Party, they said, wait a minute, no more support for ERA because our new voting base are very much women like this, the anti-family value, the family values crowd, and they don't like the ERA. So we don't like the ERA. So you see in 1980, it's the first year that the Republican Party sheds its support for the ERA. They were even supporting it in 1976 when Ford was on the ticket. He's a moderate Republican, so sort of that, the old wing, but as the first conservative in the modern era, Reagan becomes the candidate, he says no more ERA. Republicans, we have historically supported it more than the Democrats. We will not do that anymore because our sort of base is now these family values folks, and they don't like the ERA. Conversely, as the Democratic Party has become the party of modern feminism, and feminists have set their sights on the ERA, you see in 1980 the Democrats and thereafter coming out in favor of the ERA. So you saw that migration.
Yes, I do. I told you I could talk forever. I
a deeply discounted copy of the book for $35. You can sign up there, or you can take a coupon from the publisher for 20% off, so $5 more.
And also, please sign up that you came tonight. We're certainly glad you were here. The questions were very important. And Rhoda Sharma has an important announcement to make, so please, just a moment.
Did you enjoy tonight's program? Yeah. So we have part 2 coming up, but it's at the Teaneck Library on March 15th, this Friday. You can make it at 10:30. The topic is going to continue, and it's Women's Movement from Past to Present and What's Next. So if you can make that with Professor Sally Roche Wagner from Syracuse University. She's also got a book. Yeah. And then on March 21st, I want to announce that we have a program that is going to cover racism, systemic racism. And that's going to be at Fairleigh Dickinson University at 7:30 in the evening. So if you're interested in getting notices of these types of programs, I hope you will sign up and we can send you notices. And you will be apprised of all the good programs we have. So I want to thank you so much for coming, and I want to thank Don, Emmanuel Church, and the Peace and Justice Committee. Thank you so much.